to the Monkey Barrel. How are you?
Hi.
Fantastic to be here.
Yeah, it's amazing to be here. This is only my second Edinburgh.
When was your first Edinburgh?
My first one was like 15 years ago. I was saying to Tom Ballard, one of our upcoming guests, that...
Spoiler alert.
Yes, it was very good. So when I came, I was more on the pretentious theatre scene rather than the comedy scene. So it would be like, let's go see 2 hours where someone talks about the view from the supermarket shelf if you were a kumquat. Do you know what I mean?
You can see that in the comedy section. 250 at the Monkey Barrel every day.
I'm really heartened by that because so far I've walked around and everything seems very polished.
No, there's still some absolute shite here. Look at the nodding faces. For people who are listening to the audio, there are some pained expressions on the face. There is a young person sat just on my right who looks like they have seen conflict. Whereas in fact, I know what they've seen is some experimental student theatre in a venue that was only designed to hold 12 brooms. What was it? Can you give us a flavour of the vibe?
Oh God, it was a magic show. It was in the basement of a burrito shop, and the best trick was a tray of burritos falling down the stairs.
Can I take a shot in the dark and say that was not intended as a part of the magician's act?
To this day, I don't know.
I think it's very profound.
So I told you, Coco, there is some absolute... This is the biggest arts festival in the world. Odds are a lot of it's going to be fucking shit.
But you know, people always say, is this the world the left want? Yeah, this is the world I want. Let's express ourselves through very bad theatre. Speaking of which...
Is that really the way you want to introduce our first ever live show as bad theatre? I mean, in fairness, it is bad theatre. If you went to see this and it was billed as a play, you'd be fucking livid. Just by way of a cheer, who has heard the podcast before? Okay, who has not heard the podcast before? Who shouted yes? And was it Gerard Butler, who apparently is here for some reason? That's not a joke, he's really here. We don't know why. We're excited to have you, Gerard.
Pod say the UK has fallen.
Yeah.
Listen.
We're really excited. We are pitching a film idea where terrorists take a live podcast recording. So we're here at the Edinburgh Fringe. So for those who don't know, I'm Nish Kumar.
And I'm Coco Khan. And together we are Jedward. Yes!
That's what we need to say on the merch. That's what we need. The Asian Jedward. We are very happy to be at the Fringe Festival, a festival that brings together from people across the world, but let's face it, mainly the south of England. Just as a straw poll, is anyone here actually Scottish? Yes, the Scots are here. They're here. They also recently got rid of their South Asian leader, who they'd absolutely given a hospital pass to. So all the nations have something in common. Any Welsh in?
Wow.
They've all sat together as well, which is actually kind of weird. And how are the English doing? That is exactly the amount of enthusiasm this country deserves. In this of all weeks, are there any international people in? Where are you from?
Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland. Now, I hate to be this guy.
Yeah.
I believe that's still part of the United Kingdom, and there has been some consternation about that. That's what they refer to as the consternation. You've got both passports?
Irish and UK.
The Irish passport. The white person's Brexit escape card. Any Americans in?
Woo!
Oh, yeah. How are you feeling about your country? One person said maybe hopeful, and the other one, from much further away and yet more audible somehow, shouted, awful! The Americans are feeling awful. So look, we've got some amazing guests for you.
You forgot to ask if there's any Conservatives in.
One of our live shows.
Oh.
One of our live shows at the Edinburgh Fringe. Like,
What?
In all honesty, you're more likely to see Gerard Butler here. But anyway, there are no Conservatives in. If there are, sorry. For what you're about to hear. Okay, so there's no avoiding talking about the horrible news of the week. There is going to be a, let's face it, tonal shift. Once we sit down and actually discuss the terms of the week, but we're very excited to see you all. Should we bring out our first guest?
I think so.
So without further ado, let's get into it. Please give a very warm welcome to our first guest, my dear friend and biological son, Ahir Shah!
Hello. Before we get into it, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be back at Edinburgh. Obviously, I've been coming up here for a long time doing stand-up. This year, I've decided to sort of switch it up. I'm doing this magic show. It's underneath this burrito place. It's one of the few sort of affordable, sort of good deals for venues on the thing. And I've got this part where burritos fall from the ceiling. And a lot of people think that that's just an accident, but it's when you're doing magic at my sort of level. People are like, was that supposed to? It's always supposed to. That's magic, baby.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I've not been following the news, so I assume that it's just silly season.
Yeah.
And gonna there's probably like a squirrel that's done something funny or something, and just have a little nice light-hearted chat about that of an evening.
A very racist squirrel. A really large racist squirrel.
I actually think that squirrel had some legitimate concerns about who was going to be using its store of nuts.
Yeah. At the Edinburgh Festival, I think a very racist squirrel just sounds like a show that's far too whimsical for its own good.
Sounds like Noel Fielding's gone right wing. The original plan for this show was it would be a thing where we'd get on friends of ours, comedians who are engaged with the news, and we thought that it would be, you know, a light-hearted celebration of a weird year of news. Obviously, those events have somewhat gone out of the window. For the benefit of people abroad who have not been following this story, there is some context. The UK has been hit by a wave of violent rioting led by racist hard-right agitators. It started after three children in Southport were murdered and false information circulated online that the suspect was a Muslim migrant. It transpired that the suspect was in fact born in Britain and believed to be a Christian. Not that that's relevant to whether or not you should be going around smashing up mosques, but that is what happened. Unfortunately, hard-right agitators rioted and the riots spread across England and Northern Ireland. Hundreds of arrests were made. We think at the moment, as we record on Tuesday, the running total is 400. Demonstrators were heard shouting things like "enough is enough" and "we want our country back." Others of them were pictured openly doing Hitler salutes. Many of them had quite visible Nazi face tattoos. By the weekend, the demonstrations had become more targeted. On Sunday, 2 hotels that had been used to house asylum seekers had their windows smashed with bricks and fire set in their rubbish bins. A library that served as a food bank in Liverpool was burned down alongside a Citizens Advice Bureau. It has been a sort of week of truly just disgraceful scenes across the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrible state of affairs, but I wouldn't say it was necessarily surprising. I mean, how are you feeling about it?
I think in certain ways not surprising. As you say, that something like this might have happened eventually. Like I do think that a lot of the way that it's shaken out, it can't be sort of ignored that like it's really sunny and all of these people are on tremendous amounts of cocaine. And I don't think that they particularly needed an excuse to do any of the stuff.
I think we probably have to whack an allegedly on there.
People appear as though they have been consuming large quantities of allegedly. And I think I was saying this to Nish earlier this evening and over the last few days as we've been texting about it, and unsurprisingly, as I'm sure you have been texting my family about it and friends about it and talking to my wife about it and everything that's been going on. And I think that I am sort of stunned and upset and everything enough, but I would be far more so if I genuinely believed that this was representative of the country I love and the country that has been my home since the day that I was born. And I don't think it is in any way. Like, I refuse to cede this, this idea that this is the howl of the great unheard majority or silent majority who are not going to be. First of all, like, I don't think these people were ever particularly silent. You just needed to know where to look. Yeah. I sort of feel as though one of the great privileges of doing the job that I do, having done stand-up for a very long time, is that, like, I feel like a lot of people are like, oh, well, if you ever got out of your London bubble and actually saw the real country as it is, then you wouldn't be. It's like, what do you think I do for a living, right? Like, it's like my entire career has been like, I've covered more of this country than the fucking Ordnance Survey, right? Like, it's constantly wandering around, and one of my favourite things about that is that I have been able to see the full length and breadth of this wonderful place and see so many people in so many different places and so many different sizes of conurbations and different mixes of people in different areas and different classes and stuff, and none of what is spreading out this awful, like, violence and horror is in any way representative, in my opinion, of the country that I know and that I see and that I've lived in my whole life, right? And so I think that, I just don't want to cede to, like, 0.001% of the worst of us the idea that this is Britain in any way.
I mean, I agree with all of that, but I would also say that these tensions have existed here for a really long time. I think Britain does have a problem with race that it's not willing to face up to, and therefore it will keep, rearing its head. I'm not disagreeing, but I would just perhaps counter a bit that I don't think this is an anomaly. I don't think this is a one-off. I don't think this is just about cheap cocaine flooding the pubs, which I've heard about. I don't know really much about.
Allegedly.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Again, I think that it's probably indicative of how much rarer it is that we're talking about it as much as we are as well. When I hear about the sort of youths of the generation above me in my family, where all of this sort of street violence and stuff was just so entirely normalized that it was just like, oh yeah, well, obviously, like, I was out, so that happened. Right. Whereas now it's at least sufficiently different that it's something that is worth, like, everyone going, oh my God. And the vast majority of people are quite rightly going, oh my God. And there was an interesting, like, sort of social surveys attitude that I saw from Ipsos that was done in 2020, where 93% of people disagreed, with 84% strongly disagreeing with the statement, to be truly British, you have to be white, which had changed from 2006, where it was 82% who disagreed and only 55% disagreed strongly. The amount who agree with the statement had fallen quite commensurately. 89% of people said that they would be happy for their child to marry someone from another ethnic group. 70% strongly, changing from 2009, where it was 75 and 41 strongly. And I'm
glad you brought some facts to this. Thank you very much for doing that.
And so I do think, the sample size, the population of this country is overwhelmingly white, right? So the sample size of this poll was overwhelmingly white. And I do think that that's indicative of the fact that, I just don't want to... I feel like if you view everything through, well, hope is lost, then, and in the... I just feel like on the spectrum of being hopeless and being naive, I really sort of have to be closer to the latter, because
there's something in between the two, though, isn't there? There's something in between the two. There's sort of recognizing that there's still problems and those people are still reluctant to change, and there's an ecosystem around them, from the media to politicians, that capitalize on that, but also recognizing that when the far right came to Liverpool, Bristol and countless other cities, human beings in bigger numbers came out to put their bodies in between them and other people.
Yeah, for sure.
So both can be true at once, right?
And that has been an extremely heartening thing to see. Like, the people who I want to focus on are the people who are out with the dustpan and brush the following morning, cleaning up, and everyone doing it together. Because actually, like, that's their community. Like, the people who are coming together to clean everything up are actually from the community. It's people who have come in to cause problems just for that, and then they bugger off again, and it's left for the actual community to pick up the pieces, but then that's where the community get to show their togetherness. And stuff like that.
You're a more generous person than me, because those are not the people I want to focus on. The people I want to focus on are I can't deal with this idea that all of this was manufactured by Russian bots. I keep reading it was Russian bots, and you're like, well, Russian bots have clearly been incredibly busy, because they seem to have been writing a huge number of editorials for the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Telegraph, the Times, the Sunday Times. They seem to have done a really interesting job on writing some adverts for Nigel Farage's Brexit campaign. They did a really thorough job on Suella Braverman's speech at the Conservative Party conference, where she essentially reprised large sections of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. There are figures within what we recognise.
Matt Goodwin has actually been a server in St. Petersburg for...
There are people that exist within the kind of what should be, or what we normally consider to be, the sort of mainstream conservative ecosystem, and that including within the Conservative Party, and within the kind of opinion and editorial pages at a huge number of conservative newspaper columns, that have consistently pushed this idea that immigrants are the problem, refugees are the problem. The Labour MP for Tamworth, I hope now has deep regrets about specifically citing the hotel in Tamworth that was housing refugees and asylum seekers that a number of these, protesters, in inverted commas, set fire to. I think it's fine to emphasise the kind of hopefulness in this situation, but I also think we need an actual conversation about the lack of accountability for some of the people who have fanned the sort of flames of this that still continue to exist within the kind of ecosystem of our mainstream political conversation.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong, like, there's... and there is absolutely, like, as you say, it's sort of quote-unquote protesters with quote-unquote legitimate grievances. And my sister did not text me worrying about me traveling around a few days ago, because she was like, someone might politely approach you with their legitimate grievances. You need to make sure that you're across that. Equally, there is a word for political violence conducted with the express aim of causing fear, and it's not protest, as far as I'm aware.
It's kind of a personal frustration of mine, because you and I have worked on things where we tried to have a more evolved conversation about race in this country, and those things that we worked on, we were often sort of shouted down essentially by voices again in the mainstream conservative press. And like, the most positive thing I think can come out of this is that we actually start to have a more honest conversation about how we talk about immigrants and immigration, and how we talk about asylum seekers and refugees. And this is a moment for like an actual temperature check. The kind of temperature check we didn't have really after Joe Cox was murdered. So again, for international listeners, for context, in the lead up to the Brexit vote, a Labour MP who was a very outspoken advocate both of the cause of remaining in the European Union but also the rights of refugees, was assassinated by a man who would go on to give his name in court as Freedom for Britain. And the push to not talk about the implications of that was something that I think has led us on this kind of path to where we are.
And led on the evening of the referendum result to Nigel Farage claiming that the referendum had been won without a shot being fired. Which was, to say the least, spectacularly.
I mean, I have to say, I also share your personal frustrations. I come to it as a member of the press, and seeing some of my journalistic colleagues, I use that phrase in a polite way, they are not my colleagues.
In the way that we've been using protesters.
I mean, some of the things my journalistic colleagues have said, it's fascinating. They blew the dog whistle for so long, and now the dogs are here and they're surprised.
Yeah.
And
now they're coming over all Baha Men on us.
Who let their dog? That's a terribly sexist song. Did you know that?
Is it?
Yeah, for years I thought it was about dogs.
Is it not about dogs?
Apparently it's about unattractive women.
What?
I know.
Are there no heroes left? Will cancel culture not rob us of another one of our icons? the Baha Men got.
Yeah, and on a more serious point though, it has been fascinating to see some of those antagonists dial their language back in the last few days, partly because I think they've seen what they've done and they want to distance themselves, but partly because there's now rules coming in saying if you stir up shit on the internet, we're coming for you. And you literally see them being like, oh, well, you know, I wouldn't say invasion. I wouldn't say that's like, yeah. But you have said it multiple times.
Turn gunboats on the migrant.
I wouldn't say that.
Yeah, wouldn't mind the policing bill being sent to Elon Musk directly.
Yes, you know, again for further context, Elon Musk has been, you know, being his usual temperate self. I tell you what, if that man has had any of his neurologically enhancing chips implanted in his own brain, he's the worst fucking advert for them. He's been suggesting that civil war is imminent, and he's been referring to Keir Starmer as two-tier Keir, referring to an analysis of this situation, a word I'm using very loosely, by people including Nigel Farage, that have established that there is some sort of two-tier policing system between the Black Lives Matter protests and, again, the quote-unquote protests that have been happening over the last couple of weeks. I think we can all agree, if there's one group in this country that have had a great relationship with the police, it's black people. So, second only to all women. Coco, I just want to talk to you a little bit about this. Like, you come from a Muslim background. Yeah. There is a specific element to this that is very specifically and very virulently Islamophobic. How emotionally do you feel in terms of when you see stuff like this?
It's really weird because I am not especially religious. When I was growing up, there wasn't a huge amount of I'm saying that because it might reveal that I'm old, Nish. So actually, maybe I hear that people that grew up in the 90s...
Allegedly.
Like before 9/11, you were just Asian, right? You were just Asian, and there wasn't a huge amount of distinction between your religion. After 9/11, that changed. So I sort of had a lot of my formative years in a community that was quite collectivist, really, that we all are othered in this world, not just us as Asians, but also, you know, our Black community, East Asian community. There's so many others, particularly in London where I was growing up. And so I think one of the hardest things is, of course, coming from a Muslim background, it's horrible to hear the dehumanizing, like, monstering of people that it's just ludicrous. I mean, I don't know if these people have ever met a Muslim, and if they want to, I was going to say, if they want to, come and meet mine, but actually, no, fuck off. I don't really want to meet you guys. So it's of course it's horrible, and of course it gets to you, and of course, you know, you have these quiet moments where it makes you sort of cry. But another thing that hurts me the most is not just my own community being so monstered, but that feeling of isolation, because they have been, when I say they, I mean like the power structures, you know, institutional racism, blah, 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 all of that sort of stuff has been working efficiently, I would say, since 9/11 to create distinctions between us, to create a hierarchy, to say you guys are worse than us, we're better than you because we are more, I don't know, whatever, educated, or we are more wealthy, or we are less terroristy, or whatever it is. And so then you have this moment where, like, almost in a way, of course, like, we are stronger when we're together and we're a united front, and they chip away at that, and then you're just one community on your own. Is it a surprise they come for you then when you're at your weakest, in a way? And I think that's been hardest, not so much just for me and seeing how much my family are scared. I mean, like, literally, I get texts all the time from people being like, do you think I should take my pendant off? You know, I wear a little pendant. Do you think I should avoid this area? A friend of mine, actually, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, a friend of mine texted me the other day, she's in Birmingham, and she was like, oh, I'm feeling really down, my sister's got some intel that there's going to be an EDL march in Small Heath, and, you know, we're all feeling anxious about it. So I said to her, you must tell the police about that. So she was like, yeah, but it's a rumour, she got it off WhatsApp, I don't know if it's true, don't want to waste their time. And I was like, that's the police's problem, tell the police. So she rings the police, and they say, yes, we're aware of this march, we've got intelligence on it, we're going to be sending officers, but just so you know, stay home, love. Tell all your family to stay home. And it was weird. Like, wow, you're literally being told by authorities, hide away, close the curtains, don't let anyone know you're here. Those stories really, really make you sad. But yeah, like on that wider level, just that feeling of like, wow, what happened to solidarity? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Anyway, sorry, that was really depressing. God.
No, I think that would be. I think it would be stranger if you were not.
If I was really cheering.
Yeah. Imagine if we all opened with, "This is sick." Been having a great time.
Yeah, we've had a great time. Some of the WhatsApp chats that we've been having. Oh my God, it is meme central.
It's meme city. Mum's thrilled.
My mum has never been less stressed. Before we move on, I just want to say one very, very brief thing, and that is just like, because we have a lot of young people that listen to this podcast. Admittedly, none of them are here, with respect. And I just want to say to like young people of colour, I just want to say to you, like, it's okay to be scared right now, because it is scary. I'm scared, like, without wishing to delve too deeply into my back catalogue. I had a panic attack yesterday because I have post-traumatic stress disorder that I was diagnosed with after a series of racist death threats that I received in late 2019 and early 2020. So, like, when I say I'm scared, I am medically scared. So I'm just prefacing that to tell you that I think it's okay for you to be scared. But I think we will be okay in the end, right? Because none of this is new. Like, none of these people are anything that we have never seen before. These people on the streets, these people with their Nazi salutes up, they haven't even got a new guy. They're still using the same guy from the fucking 1940s. That's how little they're making new people. They still have to use the same guy. And these are the same people. They threw rocks, they set dogs on our grandparents and our parents. They're the exact same people. It's the same thing over and over again, right? The same hate that ran in those people's blood pounds through their veins, okay? But at the same time, we're going to be okay because we are the children and the grandchildren of the people who defied them the first time around, okay? So it's okay to be scared, but learn the lessons our mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers taught us. Stand your ground, be brave, we'll be okay, okay? And that's all I want to say about that. Just when you thought this show had all that it could possibly take, we are about to pull another trick out for you. Please welcome to the stage our second guest, the veritable burrito down the staircase. All the way from Australia, and all the way indeed from the back of the room, one of my favourite comedians in the world, the incredible Tom Ballard!
Lovely.
Hi, Tommy.
Hello, everyone. A pleasure to be here to provide the white perspective. A little bit of balance, yes. Jinx.
Coco, would you like to introduce Tom in the way that you decided you analysed his career and made a call on what you felt about him?
Well, I'm feeling quite bad about it
Why?
now. Because I observed... So... You probably already know Tom if you're fans of comedy, but if you aren't familiar with him, he's very, very famous, particularly in Australia, because he had a satirical politics show, not vastly dissimilar to Nish's show, The MASH Report. And like The MASH Report, he got pulled by Conservatives. So I sort of, you know, in a nice, friendly way, said, "You're Australia's Nish Kumar." And actually, on reflection, I think that was maybe not so nice.
I don't think I've ever heard someone be compared to me and thought, they're probably thrilled with that.
Well, I'd be honoured if anywhere near the same amount of people watched Tonight with Tom Ballard as The MASH Report. Our show was once beaten in the ratings by a repeat of Juice Bigelow, European Gigolo. But it's much cooler to say that we were censored by the man.
You did get in trouble for describing a right-wing politician as a cunt, though, right?
That is not true!
I thought that was just a greeting in Australia.
Greg Larson was playing a character and referred to a Conservative commentator as a cunt, yes.
But cunt is... I've been to Australia, and let me tell you, they throw that word around like confetti. Tom... I don't know if you can relate in any way to being incredibly disappointed by your country at this moment in history. I watched your show, which is absolutely brilliant, and you should all go and see it. One of the kind of pivotal events that's contained within the show is the Indigenous voice referendum. Now, for non-Australians or people who don't follow Australian news, could you just contextualise what the premise of that referendum was?
Yes, it was a controversial, culturally toxic referendum. I don't know if you guys do that kind of thing here, but if it ever comes up. Try not to. This is a referendum we had last year to change the constitution. We have to have a referendum if you want to change the wording of our written constitution in Australia. And the idea was to establish what was called the First Nations voice to Parliament. It was a constitutionally enshrined body that was going to be voted for and elected and made up of First Nations people to advise the government and the Parliament on laws affecting First Nations people to try and close the very shameful gap between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in Australia. Our constitution does not recognise the First Peoples at all. It's a colonial document. And, you know...
You're welcome.
That's really nice that you took credit for that. That's really sweet. That's really sweet. It's like when a child wears dad's clothes. It's nice.
Deserved more.
So sweet. Yes. So, and it was the promise of the Labor government when they were running for election 2022. They said, if we win, we will hold this referendum. It harked back to a statement that was created by First Nation leaders called the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is trying to outline the vision for First Nations justice in Australia. And we're all very excited. The polling started off really positive. Sound familiar? And then over the course of a very demoralising campaign, of a yes and no campaign, which are publicly funded, the no campaign led by conservative Aboriginal people, which was fucking annoying. Eventually, the results came down and 61% of Australians voted no. Didn't get a majority yes vote in a single state across the country, and it was seen as a massive failure and a big step backward for First Nations justice, in Australia.
The show sort of deals in your particular anger towards that. How do you maintain an optimism for the idea that you can push towards, because you're a comedian, but also you've been very active in the Australian Green Party. I would say in terms of the stakes of political comedians, you very much sort of put your money where your mouth is, and you work very hard.
So you're the British Tom Ballard?
Yeah. I don't put my money where my mouth is. I put my money in my house. But how do you push back against hopelessness, especially at a moment like this where it feels like, I don't know, I mean, again, just as an outsider, somebody that has spent a decent chunk of time in Australia, has a lot of Australian family and friends, and, feels invested in that country moving to a version of its better self. How do you sort of maintain the optimism in the aftermath of a moment like that?
Oh, fuck. I don't know. You saw the show. I mean, the point of the show is, yes, that feeling of I mean, look, this happened on October the 14th, which was, a week after the October the 7th attacks. Cal Wilson, an amazing Australian comedian, passed away that same week. It was a really shitty fortnight, and it was a moment similar to 2016, Brexit, Trump, that feeling where, like, I know the world's pretty fucked up, but moments where you're like, it's actually worse than previously imagined, and actually... those kind of political moments that shake your faith in the common decency of most people, right? Like, I'm a democratic socialist. I have to think that most people are all right and want good things. And the voice was so moderate. I mean, a big critique from the left is that it didn't go far enough, and it wasn't give First Nations people enough power over their own affairs. So there was a left-wing progressive no vote. It was quite marginal, but it did totally exist, led by some First Nations leaders. So it was like, this cost nobody anything. It would make nobody's life worse. Everybody agrees that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been fucked over by Australia's colonial history. How could you really think that the best thing for the country was to reject this idea? That's what was particularly demoralising. And when you're, again, on the left, we need to believe that most people are all right. You need to believe that most people, if you talk to them about the left-wing political program you have, will make their lives better. Those moments when you go, actually maybe not, are pretty hard to bounce back from.
Do you think that conducting things like referendums is more difficult in Australia because all of the forms are upside down?
I feel like
it's pretty fucked up and racist, man.
I've spent so much time with Ahir, both because we're friends and because we've done so much work together. And I can always tell when he's got two things on the brew, a shit or a stupid question.
Well, they are particularly hard in Australia because it's compulsory voting, and to get a referendum through to change our constitution, you need to get a yes vote from the majority of all the voters and a yes vote in 4 out of the 6 states.
Yeah.
Can we just clarify? Got a good answer out of that. Yeah. That was information that I did not have going in.
God, you're like an accidental Graham Norton. Whoops! I slipped and landed in some insight. You do have mandatory voting. That's you know, what was
people talk about that a lot here as being
what was our
a
election turnout in the end? Was it about 60% or something?
Yeah, in the 60s.
Yeah, it was about 60%. It's constantly seen as something that, you know, mandatory voting is something that it's interesting because Australian politics here, you know, there's huge cultural relationships. Both countries are kind of both shaped by the Murdoch-owned media in so many ways, and there's often two things that are held up by the two, I guess, loosely different wings of politics in this country. The more progressive side, I would say, often floats the idea of mandatory voting as being something that we should bring in, but you get fined if you don't vote, right?
Yeah, like $50 or something. And most people, not most people who do that probably don't aware. I mean, you can also just turn up and just put the form in blank. You don't actually have to vote. You have to turn up and get your name crossed off.
Right.
Yes, I mean, I think it seems like the least that one could expect of a civic duty of everybody. And I mean, some would say that it has something of a more centrist effect on our politics, perhaps, and that people say that you have to win Australian elections from the centre, so maybe it's a moderating factor. Yeah.
Here he is, fucking brown starmer.
But I think it's good. Voting's fun. We have sausage sizzles as well, so you get like a free sausage.
Please contextualise this, because I think this is one of my favourite and most intrinsically Australian facts. They literally have voting barbecues for sausages.
Voting barbecue for sausages?
That's kind of how I understand it.
When you go and vote, it's a tradition. If you vote at like a primary school or whatever, there's often a barbecue there, and you get what's called a democracy sausage. Yep. Guys, we are a real country, okay? And we have serious issues, but also get a bloody sausage on there.
A demo sausage?
Struth! I just did me bloody civic rights.
So for someone like me who is really interested in voting but does not eat sausages, what are the vegetarian options at the democracy sizzle?
We'd tell you to go harden the fuck up, mate.
But the other side of it, so the progressive side sometimes floats this idea of mandatory voting. The other side of it is the conservative movements in the last decade in this country have used Australia as a kind of model for an immigration policy. But the offshore detention, it was awful. And the points-based immigration system was horrendous. Right?
Yes, 0 stars, would not recommend. Yeah, I mean, look, you've got the constant xenophobia, the immigration conversation. In Australia, we had something called the White Australia policy that wasn't dismantled till the 70s, for fuck's sake. So there's the general xenophobia, fear of people of colour through immigration, through legal routes, we might say. But then there's been particularly this insane panic about boat people ever since, really, the late 70s, really, when, in the wake of the Vietnam
we
War.
are struggling to connect to the idea of a confected panic about people arriving on boats.
Yes. Well, Australia's the OG. Stop stealing our ideas. 2001 was a particularly big flashpoint. We had this moment where a boat called the Tampa was held offshore in the wake of 9/11, and elections coming up, and John Howard sends the army in, makes sure that these people fleeing Afghanistan, some of the most vulnerable people in the entire world, are perceived as some kind of threat. There was footage of some people in the boats, and there were children in the water. The government tried to sell that as if these people had thrown their children into the water in order to be refugees. It was called the Children Overboard Affair. It was a total bullshit. It was an absolute smearing of those people, one of the most disgraceful moments in Australian history. And then since then, there's just been this constant panic and this war. Most heartbreakingly, our Labor Party shifting to the right. Can you relate? And initially declaring John Howard's Pacific solution to be inhumane and monstrous, as it absolutely was. They reversed it. More boats arrived. They responded by moving even further to the right and saying that anyone who comes to Australia by boat will never be resettled there, and set up these detention camps in Nauru and Manus Island. It's horrific, and Stop the Boats was like literally the slogan of Tony Abbott, one of our former prime ministers, and it is wild to see it all just play out exactly the same way here.
It's weird, isn't it? Because you've relayed there several policies that have been emulated in the UK, and all of them went terribly wrong. And I imagine that there's someone in Conservative HQ that was like, I heard there was a great idea in Australia. Let's not look at what happened. Let's not. Just as a brainstorm, as a feeling. Is that weird? Is that a weird position to be in?
Well, I mean, look, in brutal political terms, if you're literally just interested in stopping the boats, I mean, you would say that the horrific policies that were implemented did stop the number of arrivals of boats that came, right? Now, the cost of that was putting people in fucking torture camps and letting them linger there indefinitely forever. So if your concern is, hey, these are some of the most vulnerable people in the world who have a legal right to seek asylum under the Refugee Convention that Australia played a key role in establishing, something we should be fucking proud of, if your concern is about their welfare and their ability to seek asylum by right, it was a total catastrophic failure. From a political point of view, in terms of actually stopping the number of votes arriving, it did work in that respect. That's the thing that is particularly depressing about it. And people who've advocated for this policy were able to play some kind of humane card in which they were saying, well, people are dying at sea, which was true. They were taking very dangerous journeys, and some of them were shipwrecked and died. And obviously, everyone has an interest in stopping that. It's just that the way you do that is not to send them to literally a prison island where their human rights are being abused, and in many cases were being sexually assaulted by guards there, by a privatized security guard, and some people were driven to suicide. There was a truly horrific case of a man becoming so desperate that he set himself on fire. And a very famous political cartoon, which is a depiction of a man putting himself on fire, and the subtitle is "Not Drowning." Okay, like just exposing the horrific logic of this policy and where it leads. Yeah,
I think
so. It was a very funny show.
It was.
It's weird that so this started with people who were coming from Afghanistan to Australia.
Well, yes, or originally Vietnamese folks, and then yes, as more conflict that we partake in kicks off. Surprise, surprise.
But it's interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I was of the belief that lots of the interior of Australia was originally mapped by people who explored it, who were brought from Afghanistan because of their expertise in getting over that sort of threat. So it's sort of really weird to be like, thanks for letting us know what's in our country. Now get out of it forever.
We have a shitload of camels there, I believe, that were also, imported by those folks. Yes.
I can't fucking believe that that's the same bloke that just asked if the forms are the wrong way round.
He contains multitudes, Nish.
Why do you think that we never copy any of the fun Australian policies, going to Eurovision and everyone being excited to see you?
I don't know.
That would be a fun one if we did that.
You should give that a go, yeah. We're trying to get into NATO too, which I think is a really, really bold move.
Well, my brother's called Nathan, so when he's in Australia, he's already called NATO. So, in a way. But I mean, the one thing that'd be interesting to emulate is the fact that the Australian election result that happened at the in 2022. There was a huge influence of an environmental vote, right? Both in terms of people voting for the Greens and also people voting for the Teals, who are a group of independents who kind of worked tactically to oust Scott Morrison. But I mean, does it feel like that's something that can be imported politically from Australia, or is that simply because you are at the sharp end of some of the most serious problems of the climate crisis? The fire season in Australia is worsening every year as the average temperature increases. Is there a way for people to have that awakening that green politics actually has to be a part of the way you think about how you vote in elections, without it occasionally just being the case that your country's on fire?
Yes, it helps. When you're constantly on fire and flood, it really does attune some people's minds to it. Well, I think a big response in 2022 was a reaction to the very strong presence of climate denial in Australia, which I don't think is as acute here. I mean, we have conservative governments in the UK who have actually done some shit, I think, or at least taken some
I'd say the
action.
politicisation of the climate crisis is actually a relatively recent phenomenon, and it was part of a kind of increasingly desperate Conservative Party trying to, essentially find anything that it could use as a wedge issue in an election it probably was going to lose. But previously, regardless of how conservative the government has been, there hasn't been the same politicisation of the climate crisis yet. But
right. Yes. Whereas that is not the case. I mean, the fossil fuel industry, makes massive donations to both our political parties on both sides. The gas industry, particularly, is a massive donor to the Labor Party, and Labor is mad for gas now. Gas. But as recently as Tony Abbott, who was Prime Minister up until 2015, this is a guy who said that the climate science is crap. Wound down, our carbon tax that we introduced that was actually reducing emissions. I mean, the presence and the fuel of climate denial in Australia is very, very powerful. The mining industry is huge, and I think that's played a big role in it. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask, like, is a lot of that to do with the sheer weight and size of the domestic mining industry, particularly like concentrated out west, and the fact that being able to be the lucky country throughout 07, 08 and riding that wave of no recessions for absolutely ages because you were able to export raw materials to China for... I'm just trying to prove that I don't actually think that forms...
It is a shame that Australia has still invested so heavily in mining and does not have access to any means by which to harness solar power, because it's famously a country that receives almost no sunshine.
I got a sunburn in Australia once.
You got a sunburn? Oh, I got a sunburn in Kenya once. You get it. You get why white people are so angry, don't you? That was the first time I understood. I was in the sort of equatorial sun. It is worth noting, as another public service announcement, to go along with my genuinely heartfelt speech about staying brave in the face of the far right. If there are people of colour out there, it can happen to us. It can. It can. There's a person of colour in the front row who's saying to me, it can. And it did happen, I assume, to you. You think it's not going to happen? I was in the equatorial sun in Kenya, and I was with my friend who was white, and I said, I think I'm allergic to something. And he was like, yeah, the sun. Okay, listen, we are almost finished with our actual time. Does anyone have a question? If you don't have questions, no, we go straight up. Listen, we've got to have a question from you because you contributed pretty heavily to the old should non-white people put sun cream on chat.
Hi.
Hello.
The first thing I want to say is I used to sunburn when I was a baby, and my sisters used to laugh at me because I literally lived in the south of England, and it was really embarrassing. I know. That's not my question, by the way. My question is, I feel like sometimes to counter British nationalism, like I'm both Sudanese and British, and I would say I very much feel both, but I feel like sometimes when like I see these riots and like I feel like I have to really accept being British and like downplay being Sudanese in order to like be like, yes, I am British and I love living here, but sometimes I don't always feel like that, so I just wondered what were your thoughts on that kind of thing?
I'll field this one. I'm sorry, I'll shut up and apologise.
I mean, I think the sort of fight is to be able to always acknowledge all the elements of your character and personality. You know, like, I'm a British person who was born here. Neither of my parents was born here. So I have very strong cultural and familial links to India and to Indians and Indian culture, and I have never really seen either of those I've never really understood. I guess it's the fortune of the generation that we grew up in. Like, I feel like we grew up with enough British Asian role models, and I'm thinking specifically, and I'm genuinely not being flippant when I say this, comedians like Sanjeev Bhaskar, Meera Syal,
100%.
Nina Wadia, Kulvinder Gill, who were doing Goodness Gracious Me. There was a show whose comedy inherent within it celebrated the idea that it was possible to be completely conversant with your Indian identity whilst not denying the fact that you yourself were born in Britain and grew up. I've never understood why those two things are fundamentally incompatible. I watched a video, and I know this sounds trite, but I watched a video of a group of India and Pakistan cricket fans in England who were taking a break from watching the live game so that they could watch the penalties in the England football shootout. And that's the person that I've always been. That's who I've always been. And I don't see any reason why I need to turn up or turn down any part of my character.
100%.
We've got more questions that we should have allowed more time for the Q&A.
First, I wanted to say one time I did venture into whiteness and got sunburned while skiing. So
whoa!
It's technically snowburn. It's so embarrassing. You get it because it reflects off the snow.
No.
It's just like, we did this to ourselves. We don't belong in the mountains. What the... Anyway.
That happened to me once when I was looking too closely at Tom.
I live in Germany and...
Guten Tag.
Yeah, hi.
Deal with that, funny man.
So we're in this thing called the EU, and there was.
All right, rub it in. Come on, rub it in then.
No, there was obviously the vote, and you could vote when you were 16, and everyone's like hopeful and yay, the youth are going to save us. And in Germany, a large portion of 16 to 24-year-olds voted for AfD, which is like just a less kind of, I don't know if less intelligent UKIP is, I don't know who I'm insulting more there, but it was disheartening. And the thing about, you should teach it in school and everything, I went through the German school system, and you learn, like, essentially year 8 through 12, all you do in history is Nazis. And usually taught in a way like they're bad. So I don't know how this happened. I don't know, like, how do you, if that's what 16 to 24-year-olds, how they're voting, I don't know if you can really answer that, but what do we do with them?
Well, look, I mean, there is a lot of quite extreme right-wing views brewing amongst younger demographics. I think it's unrealistic to say that they're not, and to paint everyone as being progressive. I think it's an issue. I mean, I came across an interview with someone recently, and I can't remember who it was, so that's fine, because it's not going in the podcast, so I don't need to have facts. But they were saying that they felt that sometimes there's a head case and there's a heart case for everything. And actually, many times the heart case is just, I just want to fuck it up. I want to transgress. I want to have that feeling of kicking it to something, even if it's kicking yourself in the face or getting a brick to your balls, as we saw some far-right people did. And I think there is an element of that with younger people. And I think that feeling of like wanting to kick against something, I still don't fully have a handle on why people become so far right so quickly. I think that we've identified factors on this show, dog whistle politics, right-wing media, disinformation. But I think also it's maybe because the counter stuff we don't have as much of. We don't have as much community, solidarity, shared projects. We don't have that either. So, I mean, I don't know how to fix Germany, although I am open. Do you know a friend of mine is a techno... This is true, I'm not making it up. I'm not doing stereotypes of Berlin. But a friend of mine is a techno DJ and got hired, of course, to do a Europe Day techno party to encourage young people to vote. Yeah. Keir Starmer could never.
I also think there's a real, and I only know this, I'm recycling information I've been given from my cousin who is 16, but he's always saying, this idea that all these TikTok and stuff is just full of cool, just stop oil, progressive people is kind of a fallacy. And there are lots of surveys. We talked about one on the show a couple of weeks ago about how young boys appear to be being radicalised by people like Andrew Tate. And we've seen this week that Andrew Tate's misogyny goes hand in hand with views about immigration and views about LGBTQ rights. There is an issue with unregulated social media platforms that we mean that we're brewing another crisis in younger generations.
I'll just say briefly, just the assumption that young people are inherently going to vote left or progressive doesn't play out in history. Thatcher won the youth vote. Reagan won the youth vote in Australia. John Howard won the youth vote in 1 year. Yes, I mean, there are stats now that millennials and stuff are staying more left-wing as they get older, which is sort of good news. But yes, there's certainly some very troubling trends at the moment, and I think that has much more to do with the material conditions, the future that young people are faced with, which can often be pretty bleak. That's when the far right comes along and says, well, you know who to blame for that? These fuckers over here. Yeah. And on the left, I think we need to point that anger upwards at the ruling class.
My answer is in 3 parts, preceded by an addendum to something that Tom said, just because it's, again, really important to me that you know. Really think that one of the things for millennials sticking to, generally speaking, left parties, well, certainly in the Anglosphere, is probably to do with the fact that the housing crisis is most acute in those things, and I think a lot of stuff is downstream of housing pressures. Yeah. As you said, if you were born in the 1950s in the UK, 2024 was the first general election where if you voted along with the majority of your age cohort, you were on the losing side. So you were on the winning side in 79, 83, 87, 92, 97, like, because you just fought. So the popular thing amongst teens in their 20s was to vote for Thatcher during the entire 70s. There is no, I think that additionally, and I would say this because I'm a boring liberal, but there's something particularly dangerous about thinking that one's own conception of the good is the only conception of the good that can exist, or that everyone can particularly agree, and there's just something nefarious about people who don't particularly agree with this conception of the good. And I think that your point raises something interesting about things like expanding the franchise to younger ages, or mandatory voting, or the increases in proportional systems, where I only really trust people who are advocating it if they are willing to accept the worst consequence from their perspective of what will happen. So, for instance, I would completely accept the desire for a proportional voting system in this country if the person making that argument was on the left and willing to accept that that would most likely lead to a far-right government within the next decade in this country through a sort of sequence of coalition buildings, which would probably end up being deeply unpleasant. And if you are that intellectually committed to it, then God love you.
Now, unbelievably, we've run out of time. So that absolute boner shrinker of a, to be fair to him, good point. Unbelievably, we'd all rather have ended on one of his stupid questions about Australia. Ahir's show ends, which won the best show of the 2023 Edinburgh Comedy Awards. You can catch that at the Fringe from the 10th till the 23rd of August. And he's going to be on tour across the UK and Ireland later this year and early next. Tickets available at ahirshah.com. And you can catch Tom's show, Good Point Well Made, here at the Fringe as well. He'll be touring it across Europe and the UK until October. Tickets available at tomballard.com.au. I have seen both of these shows. They are both fantastic. I suspect that if you listen to this podcast, you will very much enjoy them. Thank you so much for listening to Pod Save the UK. And thank you, most of all, to the live audience who came, which we were surprised about in the first place. Thank you very much to the audience. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're listening at home, we'll catch you next week for another show from the Fringe with some more fantastic guests. That was a reduced listening production for Cricket Media. Thank you and good night.